Good morning to all, at least it's morning for me. I'm here to talk today about GDP, that's gross domestic product. Some of it's real simple, it's definitional. But the reason I'm going through it is because it's used in our theoretical considerations later on. Now, GDP is measured in two ways. One is the one which we'll use most commonly, is GDP is equal to consumption plus investment plus government plus the net of exports minus imports, which has been negative for about 45 years. But other than that, it all can be measured in terms of income, which includes revenues, which includes income, wages, profits, rents, interest, a variety of other things. What we'll be using mostly in this class will be the goods and services side, which I mentioned first, which is government and investment and consumption. And then the others we won't discuss as much in terms of imports, exports at this time. It's relatively a simple formula. And it's a kind of a measurement of how well the economy is doing. Now, we understand there's a lot of errors in it. But the errors tend to be consistent year to year, so it gives us a measure of how we are doing, even on a shorter period of time, from month to month to year. It is also not something which is a measure of how well we are doing in terms of public social welfare. Things that are counted in GDP may be an increase in executive salary. Doesn't really benefit anybody but the executive, but it does show up in its additional revenue and probably additional costs for goods and services. Another thing that shows up potentially in GDP, could be bad things, such as the cost of medical care that is caused by increased pollution. Now, obviously, the medical care is a benefit, but it doesn't mean that life is better because this is being caused by other things that we're doing as we've decreased GDP. There's a strong argument that we actually had a higher welfare for individuals in terms of what we had in terms of quality of life back in the 1970s than we do at this particular time because of the negatives and some of the other aspects such as income inequality. However, it is important to recognize that it is an important feature and will be discussed in theory. Now, I'm going to switch over to share screen. Bear with me. I'm not really super proficient all the time at all these type of things. But here's the formula that we're looking at. It's relatively straightforward. As you can see, as I mentioned before, GDP is equal to C plus I plus G plus exports minus imports. And C for consumption, I for investment, G for government. Memorize this because we'll be looking at it a lot. Generally, what you would anticipate is that as these things increase, GDP will increase. As they decrease, GDP will decrease. And it's an important consideration. Now, reasons why it's important is because we at times experience changes in some of these things. For example, we at times will experience a change in consumption. Consumption may drop off. And the reason consumption drops off may very well be because a lot of people lost their jobs due to coronavirus. And that's understandable. And when that drops off, you can expect GDP to drop off. And as GDP drops off, the overall ability of Americans to buy things drops off. I might compensate for it, but tends to also parallel. So C goes down, so does I. Now, part of the really core part of macroeconomics is to try to control these things, to make sure that GDP doesn't drop off, and that creates unemployment and issues like this, or to potentially to avoid inflation. For example, during the late 1960s and 70s, G started going up significantly. And that was government expenditures for the war expenditures at the same time for domestic expenditures. And since this wasn't compensated for somewhere else, it created an excess demand for goods and services, creating, which we'll talk about down the road. So this is a relatively simple concept. It's well explained in the modules. but it's an important one. Now let me look at one other. I'm going to pull up and show you another screen here. And it's going to be this one right here. And let's see, move that up a little bit. And what I want you to think about this is how these things add up to GDP. And we'll revisit this particularly, talk about Keynesian theory. If you look at that 45-degree line, that kind of represents all the points where income, revenues, which are on the bottom, and goods and services, which are left on the left-hand vertical column, where they match. They have to, legally and technically, I mean, just definitionally, they have to match. Income matches what we produce. And if you take a look and go across, you'll see the consumption goes across. And even when there is no real income, people have to consume. Either they consume or they die. And they continue consumption as they increase it over a period of time. If you look at the next line, it includes investment, and the next line after that includes government, and the one on top of that includes imports minus exports, which in this case is made to look positive. In reality, that's a negative figure and has been for many years. But notice that, if everything's normal and that vertical line at the intersection of the y equals AE and just straight up line A and whatever, you will notice that's, let me point that right here, right there. If that's full employment, then we're probably in pretty good shape. However, if somehow these lines come down, and all of them collectively come down, and we end up in maybe a spot like this, well, then we're talking about potentially being in a recession with unemployment and potential issues of that type. If we're talking about being in an area up here, then we're talking about possibly excessive demand, problems and pressures on the economy, and the potential for inflation. Neither one of these are desirable. We'll be talking about them very shortly. But to understand you can kind of see on this graph, and Keynes used something similar to this to illustrate what kind of problems there was. I mean, for example, if consumption was to go down, but expenditures for investment to go up, you could compensate for it. You could stay where you were. Or if even both of those would go down, but government expenditures go up, again, you could potentially compensate for that. However, within classical theory, they did not see it in quite the same fashion. And that was part of the problem that we incurred during the 1930s with the Great Recession. I will talk to you soon about the other topics. Thank you very much. Goodbye.